It was a quiet afternoon in a small, dusty town where everyone knew everyone. The air was warm, and the streets were half empty except for a few people heading to the general store. Among them walked a young woman named Clara, her eyes fixed on the ground, her steps slow and unsure. She carried a small basket in her hands, filled with a few groceries, and her old straw hat covered most of her face. Clara had been living in this town for only a few months. Most people didn't know much about her or her husband George, except that they had come from a nearby county to start fresh. At first, Clara smiled a lot, always polite and soft-spoken, but lately her smiles had faded, replaced by quietness. People had noticed but chose not to ask. In small towns, sometimes silence felt safer than questions. That afternoon, as Clara walked along the wooden sidewalks, something seemed different. She was nervous, her hands shaking slightly as she held her basket. The store owner, Mrs. Parker, greeted her kindly, but Clara's reply was faint. When she paid for her things, she glanced back toward the road as if she was expecting someone. Outside, a horse trotted slowly past, carrying a man wearing a dusty hat and a long brown coat. His name was Luke, a rancher who lived a few miles out of town. Luke was known for being quiet but fair, a man who worked hard and minded his own business. He had seen Clara before, though they had never spoken much beyond a polite good day. But something about her today caught his attention. She looked frightened, like someone running from something she couldn't escape. As Luke tied his horse near the saloon, he saw a man coming down the street, tall, broad, wearing a dark vest and boots that echoed against the ground. It was George, Clara's husband. His face was stern and his voice carried across the street as he called out Clara's name sharply. Everyone nearby turned to look. Clara froze where she stood, her hands trembling as she clutched her basket. George walked up to her, his tone harsh. No one could hear the exact words, but they could feel the tension in the air. Clara spoke softly, her voice almost lost in the breeze. Then suddenly her basket slipped from her hands and the apples she had bought rolled onto the ground. She bent down quickly to pick them up, but her husband's shadow fell over her. Luke's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't like the way the man spoke to her. Too sharp, too cold. Luke took a step closer, just enough to see better, but not enough to interfere yet. The townsfolk nearby grew quiet. The blacksmith's hammer stopped. Even Mrs. Parker, who had just stepped out of her store, froze by the door. Clara stood up again, brushing the dust off her dress. Her husband's words kept coming, and she looked down, nodding slowly. Her voice trembled as she tried to calm him, but nothing she said seemed to matter. Then, as if his temper broke for a second, he raised his voice even louder. People looked away, pretending not to notice. That was when Luke stepped forward. He didn't rush or shout. He just walked calmly, his boots crunching against the gravel until he stood a few feet away. His deep voice cut through the silence. "Sir," he said evenly. "That's enough." George turned sharply. His face tightened as he saw Luke standing there tall and steady, with that calm strength cowboys were known for. "This ain't your concern, cowboy," George said coldly. Luke didn't blink. "It became my concern the moment you forgot you were standing in front of good folks," he replied. His tone wasn't angry. It was firm, measured, the kind of voice that carried quiet authority. Clara looked between them, her heart pounding. She didn't want a scene. She didn't want anyone hurt or embarrassed. But at that moment, something in Luke's voice made her feel seen. Maybe for the first time in a long while. The street had gone completely still. The townspeople watched from windows and doorways, whispering to each other. Everyone knew Luke was not the kind of man who picked fights, but everyone also knew he didn't back down from what was right. George glared at him, muttering something under his breath, then grabbed Clara's arm as if to pull her away. Luke took one more step forward and said quietly, "Not as long as I live." The words weren't shouted, but they hit the air with a force that made even the horses nearby stir. His tone wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with promise. A promise that no one should ever have to stand alone in shame or fear. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly looked down, embarrassed. She had never expected anyone to stand up for her, especially not a man she barely knew. George looked around and saw the eyes of the whole town on him. Pride burned in him, but the silence from everyone else made him realize he had lost this moment. He let go of her arm roughly, muttered something bitter, and walked off toward the saloon, his boots thudding against the wood. Luke waited until he was gone, then turned toward Clara. "You all right, ma'am?"
he asked gently. She nodded, though her voice trembled.
"Yes, thank you," she said softly. She tried to pick up her basket, but her hands were still shaking. Luke bent down quietly, gathered the apples, and placed them back in for her. "Don't mind the looks," he said quietly. "People will always talk, but they'll forget soon enough." Clara tried to smile, a faint one, but her eyes told a story of pain and gratitude all at once. She didn't know how to thank him properly. "You shouldn't have. I don't want any trouble," she said. Luke gave a small nod. "Sometimes doing right brings a little trouble," he replied. "But it's still right." He tipped his hat, and for a moment their eyes met. It wasn't romantic or dramatic, just an understanding between two people who both carried quiet burdens. As Luke walked back to his horse, he noticed the people watching. He didn't say anything to them. He didn't need to. His actions had said enough. Clara stood there for a while, holding her basket, unsure what to do next. She knew things wouldn't be easy when she got home. But something inside her had changed. For the first time in a long time, someone had reminded her that she mattered. That evening, the town talked about what happened, how the cowboy had stepped in when no one else would. Some said he was foolish to get involved. Others said it was the bravest thing they had seen in years. But for Clara, those few words, "Not as long as I live," echoed in her mind long after the sun went down. She sat on the porch of her small house that night, staring at the stars. She thought about her life, her choices, and what it meant to feel safe. Maybe this was a sign that things could change, that she didn't have to keep living in silence. And somewhere out on his ranch, under the same wide sky, Luke sat by the fire, thinking about the woman with the quiet eyes and the heavy heart. He didn't know what her story was, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. He didn't yet realize it, but that single moment in the dusty street had tied their paths together. A cowboy's courage and a woman's quiet strength. What began as a simple act of kindness was about to change both their lives forever. The next morning, the town woke up to a quiet tension that hung in the air. Everyone was still talking about what had happened in front of the general store the day before. People whispered about how Luke, the cowboy from the ranch, had stood up for Clara when her husband had spoken harshly to her. Some admired him for it. Others said he should have stayed out of another man's business. But one thing was sure, no one looked at Clara the same way anymore. Clara stayed inside most of the morning, her hands busy with chores that didn't really need doing. Her mind replayed every moment from the day before. Luke's calm voice, the way he stood firm, and the words he said that still echoed in her heart. "Not as long as I live." It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, like a promise that good still existed in the world. By noon, she decided to step out. She walked to the small garden behind her house to pick some vegetables. The sun was bright, and the sound of birds gave her a small sense of peace. She tried to focus on simple things: the green of the plants, the soft soil under her fingers, the scent of fresh earth. But peace didn't last long. A knock came at the door. It wasn't loud, but it made her heart skip. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Mrs. Parker, the store owner, standing there with a small basket of bread. "I just thought you might like some fresh loaves," Mrs. Parker said kindly. "I baked too many this morning." Clara smiled softly. "That's very kind of you. Please come in." Mrs. Parker sat at the small wooden table looking around the modest home. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to say, you were very brave yesterday. Not everyone could have stood there the way you did." Clara looked down, embarrassed. "I wasn't brave. I just didn't know what to do." Mrs. Parker smiled gently. "Maybe not, but sometimes even standing still takes courage." She paused and added quietly, "That cowboy, Luke, he's a good man. Been in these parts for years. You should know he didn't do it to draw attention. He did it because he couldn't look away." Clara's eyes softened. "Yes," she whispered, "I could see that." After Mrs. Parker left, Clara felt something new, not fear, but warmth. People cared more than she had realized. Later that afternoon, she went to the well near the edge of town. She thought no one would be there, but as she filled her bucket, she heard the familiar sound of hooves behind her. Turning around, she saw Luke sitting tall on his horse, holding a coil of rope and a kind smile. "Afternoon, ma'am," he greeted. Clara nodded shyly. "Afternoon, Mr. Luke." He climbed down from the horse, tying it nearby. "Just Luke's fine," he said lightly. "You doing all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was soft. "I didn't get to thank you properly for what you did." He shrugged slightly. "You don't owe me thanks. I just did what any man ought to do." Clara looked at him, unsure what to say. Still, not everyone would have. Luke smiled a little, brushing dust off his hat. Maybe not. But sometimes doing the right thing doesn't wait for others to act. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just quiet. The kind that lets two people breathe in each other's calm. Then Luke spoke again. "I could use some help on the ranch, with the garden mostly. My hands are good for rope and reins, but I never could tell the difference between weeds and vegetables." Clara blinked in surprise. "You want me to help?" "If you've got the time," he said. "It's honest work. I'll pay fair, and I reckon you could use a bit of peace away from town for a while." Clara hesitated. It wasn't the money that made her pause. It was fear of what people would say. But something in Luke's tone told her it wasn't pity. It was respect, and she realized she hadn't felt respected in a long time. "I'll think about it," she said softly. "Fair enough," Luke replied. "The ranch is always open. You can come by when you're ready." He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving her with a strange feeling, a mix of comfort and confusion. That night, Clara sat by her window looking at the dark hills in the distance. Somewhere beyond them was Luke's ranch, quiet, peaceful, and far from all the gossip. She wondered what kind of man lived there alone, yet carried so much kindness in his heart. The next morning, she made up her mind. She packed a small lunch, put on her hat, and walked the dusty road leading to the ranch. It was a long walk, but she didn't feel tired. When she arrived, Luke was already outside fixing a fence. "Well, look who decided to visit," he said with a friendly grin. "I came to see that garden you mentioned," she said, trying not to smile too much. He laughed softly and showed her around her, the open fields, the barn, and the little patch of dry soil behind the house that he called a garden. "You weren't joking," she said, laughing quietly for the first time in months. "This place needs a miracle," Luke chuckled. "Then I'm glad you showed up. Maybe you're the miracle." From that day on, Clara came to the ranch almost every morning. She worked in the garden, planted seeds, and slowly turned the dry land into something green again. Luke helped when he could, though he mostly watched from a distance, letting her find her peace in the soil. Days turned into weeks. Clara began smiling more, laughing a little, and even humming while she worked. The townsfolk noticed her walking home every evening with dirt on her hands but light in her eyes. Rumors, of course, spread. Some said the cowboy and the woman were growing too close. Others said it was just friendship. But Luke and Clara didn't bother with talk. They both knew that what grew between them wasn't rushed or forced. It was something gentle, built on trust and respect. One afternoon, while they rested under a tree, Clara said quietly, "You've been very kind to me. Luke, I don't know how to repay that." He looked at her with calm eyes. "You don't have to repay kindness. Just live a life that makes you smile again." She smiled softly. "I think I'm learning to." As time passed, Clara grew stronger. She found work at the general store and began saving money. Her husband, George, eventually left town, too proud to face the people after what had happened. Clara didn't speak ill of him. She just wished him peace and let go of the weight she had carried for years. Months later, the garden behind Luke's ranch bloomed beautifully, rows of green and color that could be seen from the road. People who passed by often stopped to admire it. They called it Clara's garden. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Luke stood beside her, watching the sky turn gold and red. "You did all this," he said quietly. Clara smiled, brushing her hands on her apron. "No," she said softly. "We both did." Luke looked at her, his heart full of quiet admiration. He had seen her grow from a woman who walked with her head down to someone who stood tall, unafraid. "Guess I was right about one thing," he said. "What's that?" she asked. "That you were the miracle this place needed." Clara laughed softly. "Maybe this place saved me too." The wind carried her laughter across the fields. The ranch felt alive again, not just with crops and work, but with warmth and peace. From that day on, the people in town stopped talking about the argument in the street. Instead, they talked about the woman who turned dry soil into a garden, and the cowboy who believed in her when no one else did. And though they never spoke about that first day again, Both Clara and Luke knew it had changed everything. One moment of courage, one act of kindness, and one promise that still echoed in their hearts, not as long as I live.